It is a crisp fall day in the picturesque town of Prescott, Arizona. 19-year-old Prescott resident Pamela Pitts phones her father, Paul.
Pam wanted to know what I was doing, and I told her I was working. And she said, well, I wanted to talk to you about something. I said, well, why don't we have dinner at Murphy's Restaurant here in Prescott?
Pam lives in a small house on Lincoln Street with 2 roommates. She'd moved in just 3 months ago. But over dinner with her father, she admits she's already having second thoughts.
She says, we're behind on the rent, and she goes, I'm tired of it, and I want to know if it would be okay with you if I moved back home. And I told her, absolutely. I didn't want you moving out to begin with. And I said, when do you want to do this? She said, well, I'm going to come to the house on Saturday and do laundry. So we finished having dinner, and she left, and that was the last time I saw Pam alive. Pam was born June 25th, 1969, at K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I was stationed with the 410th Bomb Wing. Being a first-time dad was great. I loved being a dad, and Pam was a happy baby. She was very active. She was very loving and fun and friendly, and she was a real joy in my life, She loved to swim. She liked riding her bike. She liked getting out in the woods, hanging out with friends and hanging out with her brothers and sisters.
Pamela was the oldest of the 4 of us. Pam was about 2 years older than I am. Stacy is my younger sister, and then Paul Jr. is the youngest. Pam was very much outgoing. She was part of a group of friends that liked CB radios, and her handle was Dark Angel. Pam was not afraid of the limelight. I was more of the reserved, shy, quiet one. She always looked out for me. She was a pretty good big sister.
By 1988, Pam's mom and dad separate. The children stay with Paul while their mom, Carol, moves to Casa Grande, 2 hours south. Pam quit school her junior year. She's working at a local sandwich shop, but she stays connected with her high school friends.
She was a very active teenager. She was in a hurry to live life. She couldn't wait to get out there into the world and make her mark.
Pam wanted her independence. In June of 1988, she moves in with her best friend, Shelley Norgard.
I said, I'm opposed to that. You've got your own room here at home, you got your own private entrance, but she did anyway. I was kind of upset about that, to be honest with you.
They realized they weren't able to afford the rent fully, so then they had a 3rd roommate, Jeremy Anderson, who had moved in with them. From what I remember, the 3 of them got along pretty well.
Saturday, Pam did not show up to do laundry. And at the time, I thought, well, you know, they're kids. I mean, as a parent, you just kind of roll with that. And later that evening, I get a call from Shelley. She says, Pam took off, and I don't know where she's at. She goes, is she at your house? And I said, no, haven't seen her. She was supposed to be here today. And she says, well, I'm worried about her.
You know, in the 80s, we didn't have cell phones like we do today, so it was a little harder to stay in touch. We weren't super concerned because Pam liked to go hang out with friends and do stuff.
I said, maybe she's decided to stay at a different friend's house for the night or something. She has to work on Monday, so we'll find out what's going on then. Monday came, and I called the place where she works, and I asked her boss, I said, is Pam there? And he goes, no, she didn't show up for work. So at that point, I called the police department.
I went to Pam's house with a sergeant by the name of Bill Hobbs, and the door was answered by Shelley Norgard.
Shelley, do I have your permission to search Pam Pitt's room and the community area, which would be like the living room?
Yes. They found Pam's purse, her driver's license, medicine, all her personal effects were still there.
Bill Hobbs and myself sat down at the kitchen table with Shelley and asked her if she knew anything. And she said that she believed Pam had gone out partying. She wasn't really worried of anything happening to her. And she said that they had a joint checking account to pay the rent. And Shelley deposited her portion of it. And then Pam Pitts had emptied the account and wasn't paying the rent. And so she was a little upset about that. I didn't have really anything to say that her words were really that unusual. I was rooming with somebody and they stole my money that took to pay the rent. I'd probably be very upset too.
As police look for Pam, Paul Pitts begins his own search for his daughter. He starts at the high school.
In 1988, I was the assistant principal at Prescott High School. My responsibility was student services. In May of 2013, I started working for the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office as a cold case investigator. Well, I only met Pam once. She was very respectful to me. I remember that phone call from her father wanting to know if anyone at the school had seen her. And a couple days later, I remember reading in the Prescott Courier that she was a missing person.
It was very stressful while Pam was missing. Obviously, we were in school. My dad was still trying to work and looking for my sister. My parents were separated. We were in survival mode, hoping that Pam would walk through the door.
I believe a gentleman and his wife were out at Gordo's Pit.
Gordo's Pit is in a wooded area. It was a place that a lot of the local kids would go to party.
And so this one person is sifting through some refuse and he sees a human foot sticking out.
There was a big pile of garbage bags, and then laying on top of the pile was an unknown body that had been totally consumed by fire. Melted into the wrist bones was what appeared to be a bracelet, and you could make out just a couple of letters of dark and a couple of letters of angel on that.
Dark Angel, Pam's CB handle.
About the only way they were able to really prove that it was Pam was through dental records.
The search for Pamela Pitts is over. A hunt for her killer begins.
It was horrific. Somebody had to be a very evil person and very angry to have done this to another human being.
The police came to my house and they said that they had found Pam's body and that it was an apparent homicide, and that her body was burned beyond recognition.
Police cordon off the area located 7 miles northwest of town and start to process the scene.
There was a lot of trash around her and on her. The injuries to her body were gruesome. The sheer brutality of what happened to her was the most striking thing.
The body was burned so bad that they couldn't get it in the body bag without it falling apart. but it was taken to the medical examiner's office where the autopsy was performed. He noted there were fractures in the skull that he said were caused by heat, but no obvious cause of death could be determined at autopsy. During the autopsy, the ME identified heat-killed fly larvae. So we suspected that Pam had been killed and stored somewhere and then deposited on the garbage pile and burned.
2 local law enforcement agencies, the Yavapai Sheriff's Office and the Prescott Police, form a joint task force to track down Pam's killer.
Basically, they started going to the high school and interviewing people. They literally conducted hundreds of interviews of people in this case.
Since I was the assistant principal when law enforcement came to the high school, they interviewed the students in my office. They learned from a couple individuals that Pam had been seen the night of the 16th at Gordo's Pit at a big party.
Law enforcement did speak to an individual that told them about an incident after the party that night wherein Pam was killed in a ritual.
Tell me what you know about the Pamela Pitt situation.
I was with Half Track. He was all joking around saying that he had to kill some girl, saying that he finally made his first sacrifice to Satan and all this stuff.
Everybody seemed to go by a nickname. This kid named Half Track came up as having told people that he took Pam up into the woods.
He said that he took a little ice pick, he stuck it in her jugular vein, and he bled her for a little while. And then he set her on fire.
But Half Track himself never gave this information to law enforcement, and none of this was ever corroborated by law enforcement. Everybody was talking about the occult. They call it the satanic panic of the 80s.
1988 was just past the peak of the satanic moral panic in the United States. The rumors were that there were satanic cults that existed secretively within communities and were engaging in criminal behavior, even rape and homicide.
Police in Mexico arrested another suspected member of a satanic cult of drug smugglers. They're blamed for the ritual killing of 15 people at a Mexican ranch.
Authorities say as many as 30 teenagers may have been involved in the satanic cult.
A young mother was trying to burn the devil out of her son by putting him in an oven.
The satanic threat was everywhere, everyone, and everything during that period of time. In the Pitts case, I think the unusual method of homicide and discovery of the body probably lent itself to satanic interpretations and satanic rumors. I think the police have to do due diligence in looking at claims, remembering during that period of time that there's still a lot of cultural discourse about satanic cults and Satanism.
The rumor in the news was Pam might have been involved in that sort of thing, and I can tell you that was not true.
That's the power of emotion, the power of fear, the power of moral outrage, eclipsing anything that's factual.
Detectives discard the satanic ritual angle and turn to Pam's housemates, Shelley and Jeremy. They want to know where the two were on September 16th, the last day anyone saw Pam alive.
Jeremy's alibi was that he was at a football game that night, and that was kind of a significant event. And then he hung out with a couple guys. Shelley said that on the night of the 16th, she got off work, she went and picked up her boyfriend, Ray.
Who were you with the night of the 16th?
Ray, Don, John, and Terry. I don't know their last names.
Did you go partying that night?
No, I went and met Don at about 8 o'clock at Jack in the Box. We went over to Terry and John's, and we watched RoboCop.
And she said that they got done around 2:30 or so in the morning.
You sure you didn't take Pam out to the pits?
I'm positive.
So the police focused on that, talking to Ray clerks to see if Shelley was telling the truth, and they corroborated what she had said.
Detectives ask Ray to take a polygraph. He agrees. and passes. Just as detectives move on from Pam's roommates, a new possible suspect emerges.
It's been rumored Melinda Perry did pick fights with people. So there was a party at Gordo Pits, and it was rumored that she was at this party.
There was a person who said that at the party on the 16th, Melinda and Pam had gotten into a physical confrontation.
She went after Pam in the pits, and they started to fight. And during the fight, Pamela got thrown on the ground. She just kicked her head like a good 4 or 5 times. She got up, and she was bleeding, and she fell back down.
How was she bleeding?
Through the head.
From the head?
Yeah.
Some of them theorized that Melinda Perry killed her to finish the fight.
And then once that had happened, that she had thrown her body on the fire. I never actually saw Melinda fight anybody, so I don't know if that was true, but it's possible.
All you can think about is my poor kid and what kind of horror she went through. But you just want to find out who did it. It was all I could think about, day and night.
Investigators have a new lead in the murder of Pamela Pitts.
Melinda Perry had a reputation as being kind of a troublemaker. That was the indication that I was getting from the police department.
They really went after Melinda Perry as the primary suspect.
Police bring Perry in for questioning. They ask where she was the night Pam was murdered and whether she and Pam fought.
Okay, with these right...
This is on Pamela Pitts, right?
Yes.
Okay. I haven't been at the pits in like 2 months. Because every time I go out there, cowgirls start stepping up to me.
And we've had witnesses that have seen you at the pit on Friday night.
I'd say it's a lie because I was not at the pits.
Tell us about the fight you got into with Pam.
I didn't get in a fight with Pam. I've never been in a fight with Pam. I didn't tell anybody I did.
Some people that's very close to you told us that you got in a fight with her.
Nope, I sure did not.
To get to the bottom of all the conflicting stories and Perry's denials, detectives asked the Yavapai County attorney to convene a grand jury.
They've heard enough times that Melinda Perry was responsible for Pam's death that they were going to compel witnesses to tell the truth under oath. So they started this investigative grand jury. They interviewed Melinda Perry, and then they interviewed several other subjects to get to the truth of Pam's killing.
Melinda tells the grand jury exactly what she told police, that she had nothing to do with Pam's murder.
Melinda had an alibi, and a pretty strong one. And it was those guys that were musicians that played in some of the local establishments in Prescott.
Friday night, we had a party at the American Motel. I can show you Scott and Jeff. We left their jam room and we went to the motel from their jam room.
Maybe you've gotten a fight with Pam and not remember.
No. I sure did not. I always remember fights.
Four months after Melinda takes the stand, the grand jury reaches a shocking conclusion.
The investigative grand jury ended up indicting Melinda Perry for perjury, essentially because she didn't confess to killing Pam and made no progress in getting any further into the investigation as to what happened to Pam.
Melinda sticks to her story that on the night of the 16th, she was partying at a motel with her friends and a band.
The grand jury talked to some of her people, and they said the same thing. And so they sent one of the patrolmen to the American Motel to see if this person signed his name on the ledger, and sure enough, his name was there.
On December 20th, 1989, Melinda Perry is sentenced to 41 days in jail for contempt of court and failure to pay fines. But the 3 counts of perjury are dropped in October 1990.
We were focused on what was going to come out of the grand jury in '89. I actually thought that that would be what broke this case open. And it fizzled out. And they wouldn't even talk about what was in the grand jury because it was sealed.
With no new leads to fuel the investigation, like the dying embers of the fire that consumed her, the case of this dark angel's fiery demise grows cold.
I mean, they were pretty good about periodically updating me for a while, and then as time went on, I wasn't hearing much of anything. I never forget, you think about her constantly.
Yet this case, with all its strange twists, was about to take another odd turn.
There were some Embry-Riddle students exploring a mine out Iron Springs Road, found a body in a vertical mine shaft and reported it to law enforcement. The body was positively identified as Ray Clerk's. He had been shot in the head.
Ray was the boyfriend of Pam's roommate, Shelley Norgard.
To me, if you think that's a coincidence, there's something wrong with you,
Police have been searching for Pam Pitt's killer for 2.5 years. The case is getting colder by the day. But the grisly discovery of Shelley Norgard's boyfriend Ray Clerk's in a mine shaft outside Prescott reignites the case.
Ray's family knew he was missing early May. Ray Clerk's was a major alibi for Shelley in the Pam Pitts case. So that started a chain of events.
To follow this chain of events, investigators rewind 2 years. It's spring. 22-year-old student pilot Ray Clerks and Shelley Norgard are moving in together after a year of dating.
Ray liked flying. Since I've known him, it's all he wanted to do is fly. Ray and Shelley, they both like automobiles, working on cars. He was pretty laid back. He had a sense of humor. We spent most of our time in the garage working on airplanes and things like that, so that stuff he took very seriously. Every time I see a plane fly overhead, I think of Ray.
Ray earns an aviation degree and looks for work in California.
He was looking around John Wayne Airport to see if he can get some kind of job instructing in order to be qualified to meet the minimums for the airlines. But he cut his trip in Orange County short, and all of a sudden he had an urgency that he needed to return back to Prescott, Arizona. He says he's moving back to Orange County. He says, I'm going to go pack up my things and I'll be back. A couple of weeks went by, we haven't heard from Ray, so my oldest brother, Ben, he started making phone calls to Shelley.
Shelley told them that he had gotten a job flying a plane to Mexico and had left really early in the morning.
Okay, well, have him call us. A couple of days later, hey, did you have Ray call us? Well, he's not here. He's doing this. He's flying an airplane over here. I mean, this dragged on for weeks, and we felt that he was always getting the runaround.
Concerned about Ray, Renard and his brother Ben called the authorities in Prescott.
I don't remember who the sheriff was. He goes, well, what'd your brother look like? Why would you be asking us that? Well, we pulled a body out of a mine shaft that's been there for a while. I think you two need to come down to Prescott as soon as you can. So we packed up that day and we were on the road to Prescott. As we started talking to the police officers, I started to get more and more nervous about it. I said, well, we can't show you the body because it's very decayed, but we can show you what he was wearing. I was, yeah, that's his stuff. I was just numb.
Police begin their investigation by matching tire tracks found at the mine entrance to a pickup recently borrowed by none other than Shelley Norgard.
Shelley was interviewed. At the time of her interview in the house, they found blood, and at a certain point, they walked up to her car and could immediately smell, I think they documented it as the smell of death. They found blood in the trunk of her car that ended up being, the same type as Ray's.
Detectives also find a 9mm Luger revolver under the front seat.
So they actually had some physical evidence to charge Shelley.
Shelley pleads not guilty to the first-degree murder of Ray Clerks.
She denied that she had anything to do with his disappearance or murder. She continued with the story that he had gotten a job flying to Mexico.
Despite Norgard's not guilty plea, the evidence is stacking up against her. A ballistics analysis shows Shelley's gun is the same caliber as the weapon used to kill Ray Clerks.
It wasn't until they started collecting enough evidence where it became clear that Shelley had done it that she finally admitted to doing it.
Finally, after 2 years of claiming she was innocent, Norgard reverses course and admits she murdered Ray Clerks.
At Shelley's sentencing, her attorney had prepared a statement as to what had occurred. A large part of it was that Ray was moving. He was leaving the relationship, which enraged Shelley. They were out stargazing, and Ray was laying on top of the car, and Shelley, in her fit of rage, had grabbed the gun that was on the floorboard of her car and shot him in the head. Shelley's story about killing Ray is believable. The facts and circumstances around it, I don't believe it. I believe she killed Ray in the apartment, and then Ray's body was in the trunk of that car, and it sat out there until Shelley was able to borrow a four-wheel drive truck, go to her car, remove Ray's body, put it in the truck, drive it up the mountain to that mine shaft.
Norgard is sentenced to 20 years with no parole. She's given credit for the 2 years she has already served awaiting trial. Her release date would be in 2011.
Shelley's conviction in Ray's death now paints Shelley in a whole different light. She was a very young, cute, blonde girl who was kind of small, and it's hard to see somebody like that as a killer. Fast forward, and now suddenly she is a convicted killer, so obviously now she looks like more of a suspect in Pam's disappearance and death than she did in 1988.
Shelley was in prison for 20 years. During that 20-year period, we had detectives. They kept touching base with me periodically. They kept trying to see if they could make some sense out of things or find any new leads, any new evidence that they could use. And of course, as the years went by, they've got other things to do, and it kind of gets put on the back burner. And in the meantime, you're kind of in limbo over it.
42-year-old Shelley Norgard completes her sentence. She moves to Nevada, marries, and hopes to forget her past. But the Yavapai Sheriff's newly appointed Lieutenant Bolts is not about to let that happen.
The first time I became aware of the Pam Pitts cold case, I realized the sheer volume of information that had been gathered in the early stages of that case, and came to a conclusion it was untenable to have somebody work on that cold case and then current cases.
So it was in 2011 that I got the Pamela Pitts case. I immediately had a connection to this case because I identified with Pam as someone I would have known in high school, and had this happen to one of my friends, I would have been devastated. And so I felt like the personal conviction, compulsion to do what I could to solve this case.
We had concluded interviews with other people who we thought might have been responsible for Pam's murder. And so we were really left with Shelley Norgard.
There had to be something we missed. So from day one, that was it. What did we miss? What do we have that will provide us the clue we need to solve this case? In cold cases, the older they are, typically, the more material is generated in that case. So just the organization of all the photographs, the thousands of pages of reports, that's one problem. Finding your witnesses was another issue. Finding the law enforcement officers that were involved is another problem, especially in this case, 30 years later.
It would take him 5 years, but Detective Dart eventually finds a new angle in this old case.
All penal institutions in the United States, pretty much all of them, record phone calls between inmates and the outside. So we called down to Arizona DOC and asked for any recordings that they had of Shelley.
Before I even came into our investigations bureau, they collected 90-some phone calls. There was a series of phone calls between Shelley and her father where there was tension insofar as her dad was concerned that she was going to be arrested immediately upon leaving the jail.
Hi.
Hi.
What's going on?
Not a lot.
He kept making reference to that night, referring to the night Pam went missing.
Well, that's what I've been thinking for 20 years, but then I don't know exactly. You've never told me what actually happened. I'm kind of up in the air again.
And she comes back.
I had a moment. I had a huge moment.
And then the line goes completely silent.
It was very evident from that particular phone call that she, I wouldn't say confessed to the murder, but admitted her involvement in the murder.
That was a giant aha moment that actually led me to go to the county attorney's office and seek an indictment.
I got a phone call from Detective Dart, and he said, tomorrow we are going to Reno, Nevada area, and he says, we're going to arrest Shelley Norgard.
I can feel the emotions right now again. To be able to tell Paul that I was arresting the person responsible for his daughter's death, that was my huge, satisfying moment.
I thought it was a miracle. I think was probably one of the best moments of my life.
Hello, Miss Norgard?
Yes.
Sergeant Dart.
Yeah, it's Harmon now.
Okay, Miss Harmon, go down the seat. I'd like to talk to you about 1988.
Am I under arrest?
You are under arrest for murder of Pamela Pitts.
For the longest time, we have thought that Shelley killed Pam. So I was excited that they had arrested her.
I was in tears. I was amazed that after 30 years, maybe we would get some justice.
Shelley Norgard, now known as Shelley Harmon, stands charged with the first-degree murder of Pamela Pitts. But prosecutors have a warning for the Pitts family.
The county attorney's office told us, don't get your hopes up, be prepared for a long, long legal battle. You know, my answer to that is I've waited 30 years. I can see this to the end.
Anytime we take a case to court, especially a murder case, the defense is going to make a lot of motions, they're going to ask for a lot of hearings. They're trying to get all of that evidence precluded, and then you don't have a case at all.
Shelley's attorney tries to take away the prosecution's most effective weapon.
The defense attorney wanted any information regarding the Ray Clerk's case to be kept out of the trial. He didn't want anybody to know that she had been convicted of his murder and spent 20 years in prison. He argued just because she killed one person doesn't mean she killed another. And he moved that be struck and kept out of the trial.
There are numerous similarities between the two cases. In both cases, they were roommates. They were sharing bank accounts. In both cases, there was evidence of the body having been stored before it was discovered. We knew that if we won that hearing, it was going to make convicting Shelley and Pam's murder much easier.
The judge makes his decision. It's a setback for prosecutors.
The judge would not allow any of that information to come into the trial, which was a huge blow to our case.
Anybody who's done felony cases knows about Rule 404B, and that is a rule of law that the courts use to evaluate whether or not a prior bad act can come into the current trial. Typically, in my experience, most prior bad acts don't come into the current trial.
That really worried me because that was the absolute key to tying Shelley to Pam's murder.
The old adage in prosecutions is that the longer a case gets dragged out, the better it gets for the defendant.
The Pitts family weigh their options.
We got together with the prosecutor, we had a trial date set, and we said, okay, if we went to trial today, what are the chances that we're going to get a conviction? All it would take was for one juror to say, no, I don't believe she's guilty, and she would have walked free as if it never happened. What we decided on as a family, and I've taken a lot of criticism for this, is that we would offer her a plea deal where if she confessed to the crime and gave us the details of what happened and why, that she would be released on time served.
It was more important to get the confession and the conviction behind Shelley's name than it was for the time.
So we offered the plea deal, and surprisingly, she agreed to it. And so we went into court, and she stood up and she said, I murdered Pam Pitts.
Shelley was upset with Pam because the checking account was overdrawn, and Shelley was really upset with Pam about her moving out because she couldn't afford to pay the rent on her own, and she didn't have anywhere to go. So Shelley was out looking for Pam, and she knew that she goes to Gordo Pitts for parties. And so when she found Pam, she confronted her. They got into a fight. She just, lost it.
She said, I punched her and knocked her down and got on top of her, and I just kept punching and punching and punching until she stopped breathing.
And then she heard voices coming, and she realized Pam wasn't moving, and she left. That was Shelley's final story. That's all we got.
I don't feel that what Shelley stated in her allocution was genuine. She didn't have to say what happened afterwards, so we're led to believe that Shelley just left Pam's body out there and that somebody else came along and burned it and, desecrated her body. I mean, it doesn't add up.
She gave no other details, and we were not allowed to ask any questions. So the legal handcuffs, I felt, were put on us. Of course, if it were up to me, she'd be in prison for the rest of her life. But we don't live in a perfect world. She's a 2-time convicted murderer. And my advice to her husband is sleep with one eye open. We got justice for Pam. And so we have to be satisfied with that.
On the evening of December 6th, 1991, the city of Austin, Texas, was preparing for what appeared to be an ordinary winter weekend. Although Austin had already developed a reputation as one of the state's fastest-growing cities, many neighborhoods still retain the atmosphere of a close-knit community where local businesses serve families, students, and teenagers alike. Among those businesses was a frozen yogurt shop known as I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, located in the North Cross Mall shopping center. It was a familiar place where local residents stopped for dessert, where teenagers worked after school, and where parents expected their children to be safe while earning their first paychecks. Nothing about that Friday suggested that the location would soon become the center of one of the most enduring criminal investigations in the history of Texas. The shop operated normally throughout the day. Customers came and went, employees completed their shifts, and as the evening progressed, the business prepared to close. According to the work schedule, 2 teenage employees remained responsible for the closing procedures. Amy Ayers, who was 13 years old, and Eliza Thomas, who was 17, were working inside the store after business hours. Later that evening, Jennifer Harbison, age 17, and her 15-year-old sister Sarah Harbison arrived at the shop. They had come to pick up Amy after work. Those are among the final verified facts that can be established with confidence. What happened after the store closed has never been fully reconstructed. No complete sequence of events has ever been established that explains everything that occurred inside the building during the final minutes before emergency responders were called. The uncertainty surrounding those moments would become one of the defining characteristics of the case and would remain so for decades. Shortly before midnight, at approximately 11:47 p.m., firefighters received reports of a fire at the yogurt shop. Emergency personnel responded to what initially appeared to be a commercial building fire. Their immediate responsibility was to contain the flames and prevent the fire from spreading to nearby businesses within the shopping center. Once the fire had been brought under control, firefighters entered the building to examine the damage. Inside, they discovered the bodies of 4 teenage girls. The victims were Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters. All 4 had been inside the store during the final moments before the fire was deliberately set. The discovery transformed what first appeared to be a fire emergency into a homicide investigation of extraordinary complexity. From the very beginning, investigators faced a challenge that would influence every stage of the case. The fire had not simply damaged the building. It had also severely affected the crime scene itself. Evidence that might otherwise have helped establish a precise timeline or identify those responsible had been destroyed or degraded by heat, smoke, and water used during firefighting efforts. Later examination concluded that the fire had been intentionally set after the killings. Rather than being the cause of the deaths, it became an obstacle to understanding exactly how the crimes had unfolded. Investigators were forced to begin their work knowing that part of the physical record had already been lost. As specialists examined the interior of the shop, they identified additional facts that would shape the direction of the investigation. The business appeared to have been searched, and money was missing from the cash register. These observations naturally raised questions about motive, but they did not produce clear answers. Did the missing money indicate that the crime began as a robbery? Or had the scene been deliberately altered to create that impression? From the earliest days of the investigation, these competing possibilities remained under consideration. Some investigators considered whether the incident represented a robbery that escalated into multiple homicides. Others questioned whether the apparent theft had been staged after the fact in an effort to conceal a different motive. Based on the available evidence, no definitive conclusion could be reached. That uncertainty became one of the investigation's defining features. Unlike cases in which physical evidence immediately points toward a suspect or clearly establishes the sequence of events, the yogurt shop case presented investigators with numerous unanswered questions from its first hours. Every confirmed fact seemed to introduce another uncertainty. The deliberate fire had complicated forensic analysis. The missing money suggested one possibility, while leaving room for another. The absence of a complete reconstruction of the final moments inside the shop meant that investigators had to work carefully through thousands of possibilities without knowing which would ultimately prove significant. As news of the incident spread across Austin, the impact extended well beyond the immediate investigation. 4 teenage girls had lost their lives in a place widely regarded as an ordinary workplace. For many families, the case challenged assumptions about safety within familiar community spaces. A local business that had been part of everyday life suddenly became associated with one of the most difficult criminal investigations the city had ever experienced. Law enforcement agencies responded by launching an extensive inquiry. Over the months and years that followed, investigators interviewed thousands of witnesses, examined hundreds of potential suspects, collected fingerprints, and recovered biological evidence whenever possible. The scale of the investigation reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the determination to identify those responsible. Yet another obstacle soon became apparent. Although biological evidence had been recovered, DNA analysis in the early 1990s remained far less advanced than it would later become. Some samples were too limited to provide meaningful identification. Others could not be analyzed using the available technology. Evidence that might one day become significant could not yet provide the answers investigators sought. As a result, the investigation would continue under the combined weight of incomplete physical evidence, conflicting investigative theories, and scientific limitations that were beyond the control of detectives working the case. Years would pass. The investigation would eventually focus on several suspects. Confessions would later become central to the prosecution's theory. Those confessions would themselves become the subject of intense legal scrutiny. Court decisions would revisit earlier conclusions. Advances in forensic science would allow investigators to re-examine evidence that had remained preserved for decades. DNA testing would continue to reshape understanding of the case long after the original investigation had begun. But none of those developments were visible on the night of December 6, 1991. At that moment, investigators were confronted with a devastated crime scene for young victims and a series of unanswered questions whose importance they could not yet fully measure. Who had entered the yogurt shop after closing? Why had the scene been deliberately set on fire? Did the missing money reveal the true motive, or had it been intended to mislead investigators? Could the damaged evidence still reveal the identity of those responsible? These questions would remain at the center of the investigation as years became decades. Every significant development would be measured against the facts established during those first hours inside the burned store. Every new forensic examination would attempt to recover information that the fire had threatened to erase. Every legal proceeding would ultimately return to the same challenge faced by investigators from the beginning: separating verified evidence from uncertainty. The yogurt shop murders would become more than a single criminal investigation. The case would come to represent the difficulties of investigating a crime in which the physical scene had been intentionally compromised, the limitations of forensic science at the time the evidence was first collected, and the continuing importance of preserving evidence as technology evolves. More than 3 decades after the events of that December night, the investigation remains one of the most significant cold cases in Texas, illustrating both the challenges and the possibilities of modern criminal investigation, while reminding the public that the central focus of the case has always been the loss of 4 young lives whose deaths have never resulted in a final criminal conviction. To understand why the yogurt shop murders left such a lasting mark on Texas, it is necessary to begin not with the investigation, but with the people whose lives were lost. The case is remembered because it remained unresolved for decades. Yet at its center were four teenage girls whose lives were defined by ordinary routines rather than extraordinary circumstances. Before the investigation became one of the most discussed cold cases in the state, the yogurt shop was simply a workplace where young employees earned wages after school and families gathered for dessert. In December 1991, Austin was experiencing a period of steady growth. New neighborhoods, businesses, and shopping centers reflected the city's expanding population, while long-established communities retained a strong sense of familiarity. North Cross Mall was one of the shopping destinations frequented by local residents. Among its businesses was I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, a frozen yogurt shop that served customers throughout the day and into the evening. Like many retail businesses, the shop relied on teenage employees to assist customers, prepare orders, clean the store, and complete closing duties after business hours. Working part-time after school was a common experience for many young people, providing both income and an opportunity to gain responsibility. Nothing in the routine of the business suggested that it would later become associated with one of the state's most difficult criminal investigations. On the evening of Friday, December 6, 1991, the store followed its normal operating schedule. Customers visited throughout the evening, and employees prepared for closing as they had on many previous nights. According to the work schedule, 2 employees remained responsible for completing the final tasks before locking the doors. One of them was Amy Ayers. Amy was 13 years old, making her the youngest of the 4 victims. She had come to the yogurt shop to work an evening shift, performing responsibilities appropriate for a young employee in a retail business. Based on the verified information available, Amy remained inside the store after closing as part of the scheduled work that still needed to be completed before the business could end its day. Working alongside her was Eliza Thomas, who was 17 years old. Eliza also remained in the store after customers had left, participating in the ordinary responsibilities associated with closing the business. The available evidence establishes that both girls were present inside the yogurt shop after regular business hours, carrying out routine tasks connected with their employment. Later that evening, Jennifer Harbison and her younger sister Sarah Harbison arrived at the shop. Jennifer was 17 years old. Sarah was 15. Unlike Amy and Eliza, the available information indicates that Jennifer and Sarah had come to the yogurt shop to pick up Amy after work. Their arrival, therefore, became part of the final confirmed timeline established by investigators. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters, a fact that has remained one of the most remembered aspects of the case. Their presence together on that evening reflected an ordinary family activity rather than an unusual event. According to the verified information, they arrived at the business shortly before the sequence of events that investigators have never been able to reconstruct completely. These 4 names, Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, would eventually become inseparable from the history of the investigation. Yet before that December night, they were known primarily to their families, friends, classmates, and co-workers. The available factual record does not describe unusual circumstances leading up to the evening, nor does it indicate that the yogurt shop had become the focus of any known threat connected to the victims. That absence of warning became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The final documented moments before the crime remained remarkably ordinary. Employees completed work. The business prepared to close. 2 sisters arrived to meet one of the employees. These verified facts establish a straightforward timeline up to the point at which certainty ends. Beyond that point, investigators could no longer reconstruct events with confidence. The exact sequence inside the yogurt shop after closing has never been fully established. Investigators were able to determine certain physical facts during the subsequent investigation, but the precise order in which events unfolded inside the building remains unknown. This uncertainty has persisted throughout every stage of the case. For that reason, historical accounts of the yogurt shop murders distinguish carefully between what is known and what remains uncertain. The known facts identify who was present, where they were, and approximately when emergency responders were called. The unknown facts concern what happened inside the building during the interval between the store's closing and the report of the fire. That distinction has shaped every later stage of the investigation. When investigators later examined the scene, they were working from a timeline that contained confirmed starting and ending points, but lacked a complete description of the events in between. The girls had been inside the shop. The store later caught fire. Firefighters responded shortly before midnight. 4 victims were discovered after the flames had been extinguished. Between those established facts lay the central mystery of the case. The setting itself also became significant. Retail businesses such as frozen yogurt shops were generally viewed as familiar public spaces where teenagers could work safely under normal circumstances. Families expected young employees to finish their shifts and return home. Parents regarded part-time employment as an opportunity for responsibility and independence. The events of December 6th challenged those assumptions for many members of the Austin community. As news spread, attention focused not only on the crime itself, but also on the setting in which it had occurred. The fact that 4 teenagers had been found inside a neighborhood business made the incident especially difficult for the community to comprehend. The yogurt shop had not been an isolated location. It was part of a shopping center visited regularly by local residents. The victims therefore came to symbolize more than the individuals directly affected by the crime. Their deaths represented a profound loss felt throughout the community, particularly because they had been engaged in ordinary activities associated with work and family. The investigation that followed would become increasingly complex, but its purpose remained constant: to determine what had happened inside the yogurt shop after closing and to identify those responsible. Every interview, every forensic examination, and every investigative decision ultimately sought to answer questions that arose during the final documented hours of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. As investigators began their work, they understood that time was critical, yet they also faced an immediate obstacle. The fire that brought emergency responders to the scene had severely damaged the physical evidence that would ordinarily assist investigators in reconstructing events. Before detectives could determine who might be responsible, they first had to establish what evidence remained. The next stage of the case would therefore focus on the crime scene itself. Investigators would examine the burned interior of the yogurt shop, document every surviving piece of physical evidence, and begin the difficult process of determining whether the available facts supported a theory of robbery, a targeted attack disguised as robbery, or another explanation entirely. From those first examinations emerged the investigation that would continue for more than 3 decades. The events that unfolded inside the yogurt shop on the night of December 6, 1991, remain the central unanswered question of the investigation. What is known is limited to the established timeline before and after the incident. The store closed late that evening, for young people were inside the building. A fire was reported shortly before midnight, and after firefighters extinguished the flames, 4 teenage girls were found dead inside. Between those confirmed points, investigators have spent decades attempting to determine exactly what happened. The emergency call reporting the fire came at approximately 11:47 p.m. on December 6, 1991. Firefighters responded to the "I can't believe it's yogurt" location at North Cross Mall in Austin, Texas, expecting to deal with a commercial fire. Their initial task was to control the flames and protect the surrounding area from further danger. Once the fire was contained, the nature of the situation became clear. This was no longer simply an investigation into property damage or an accidental fire. Inside the building, firefighters discovered the bodies of 4 teenage girls: Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. The discovery immediately changed the direction of the response. Law enforcement officers began treating the location as a homicide scene, and the investigation shifted toward determining what had occurred before the fire began. The condition of the building created an immediate challenge. The fire had caused significant damage throughout the store, affecting the very evidence investigators needed to reconstruct events. In many criminal investigations, the physical environment provides important information about what happened. The arrangement of objects, biological evidence, fingerprints, and other traces can help establish a timeline and identify individuals connected to the scene. In this case, the fire had altered that environment. Evidence had been destroyed, damaged, or weakened by the combination of heat, smoke, and the firefighting response. Investigators had to work with a scene that no longer represented the original condition of the store before the fire. Every piece of surviving evidence required careful examination because the opportunity to recover information had already been reduced. The investigation determined that the fire had been intentionally set after the deaths occurred. This finding became one of the most important early conclusions in the case. The fire was not considered the cause of the incident, but rather an action that occurred afterward, further complicating efforts to understand the sequence of events. Investigators also determined that the store had been searched and that money from the cash register was missing. These details introduced important questions regarding motive and the purpose of the actions that followed the deaths. One possible explanation considered by investigators was that the incident began as a robbery that escalated into a violent crime. The missing money and the condition of the store supported the possibility that theft was involved. However, another possibility also remained. The appearance of a robbery could have been created intentionally to disguise another motive. The fact that the scene had been altered by fire meant that investigators had to consider multiple explanations without immediately being able to confirm one. At the beginning of the investigation, there was no single piece of evidence that provided a complete explanation. Instead, investigators were faced with a collection of separate facts that needed to be analyzed together. Four victims had been found inside the business. The store had been damaged by a deliberate fire. Money was missing. The interior appeared to have been searched. The physical evidence had been significantly affected. Each fact contributed to the investigation, but none alone answered the most important questions. Who was responsible, why the victims were targeted, and what exactly occurred inside the store after closing? The early investigation required authorities to examine every available source of information. Detectives began gathering statements, reviewing possible leads, and documenting evidence from the damaged location. Because the victims were teenagers and the location was a public business, investigators also worked to understand the circumstances surrounding the final known hours of their lives. However, the destruction caused by the fire limited what could be learned directly from the scene. The absence of a complete physical record meant investigators had to rely heavily on surviving evidence, witness information, and later forensic developments. The investigation would eventually become one of the largest and most complex criminal inquiries in Texas. Thousands of leads would be collected over the years. Hundreds of potential suspects would be examined. Fingerprints and biological evidence would be reviewed as technology developed. But in the immediate aftermath of the fire, investigators faced a difficult reality. Some of the evidence that might have provided answers had already been lost. The limitations of forensic science in 1991 added another challenge. DNA analysis was still developing, and the ability to identify individuals from biological samples was far more limited than it would become in later decades. Some biological evidence collected during the investigation could not provide a clear identification using the technology available at the time. This meant that investigators had to preserve evidence and continue searching for answers even when science could not yet provide them. The uncertainty surrounding the crime scene also influenced the direction of future investigations. Because the available facts could support different interpretations, investigators continued examining multiple possibilities. The question of whether the incident represented a robbery that led to the deaths or a deliberate attack made to appear like a robbery remained unresolved. The case did not lack effort or attention. From the beginning, law enforcement agencies devoted significant resources to identifying those responsible. However, the combination of a damaged crime scene, limited forensic technology, and incomplete information created obstacles that would continue for years. For the families of the victims, the investigation represented a search for answers that remained unfinished. The loss of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison was followed by decades of uncertainty about who was responsible and why the crime occurred. The incident at the yogurt shop became a case defined not only by what investigators discovered, but also by what they could not determine. The deliberate fire destroyed part of the physical record, leaving future investigators with the difficult task of recovering information from evidence that had survived. In the months and years that followed, the investigation would move through different phases. New suspects would emerge, new evidence would be examined, and new legal questions would develop. The case would eventually involve disputed confessions, overturned convictions, and advances in DNA technology that changed how investigators viewed the evidence. But the foundation of the entire investigation remained the same. The events inside a yogurt shop in Austin on the night of December 6, 1991. A normal place of business had become the location of a major criminal investigation. For teenagers who had been there for ordinary reasons became the center of a case that would continue for more than 30 years. The search for a complete explanation had begun with a fire, but the answers would depend on evidence that survived beyond the flames. After the discovery of the 4 victims inside the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt store, investigators began one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Austin's history. The first priority was to determine what had happened inside the business after closing and to identify the person or people responsible. However, from the beginning, the investigation was shaped by a major obstacle: the condition of the crime scene. The fire that had brought emergency responders to the yogurt shop had also damaged many elements that investigators would normally rely on to reconstruct a crime. A fire can destroy physical evidence, alter the location of objects, and reduce the ability of investigators to determine exactly what occurred. In this case, the intentional burning of the store meant that investigators were not examining an untouched scene. They were working with evidence that had already been changed. The investigation established that the fire was deliberately set after the deaths of the 4 victims. This finding became a central part of the case because it indicated that the fire was not an accidental event, but an action that occurred after the killings. Investigators, therefore, had to consider the possibility that the fire had been used to damage evidence and complicate their ability to determine what had happened. Among the early findings was evidence that the store had been searched. Investigators also determined that money from the cash register was missing. These details created important questions about the motive behind the crime. One possible explanation was that the incident began as a robbery. The missing money and the condition of the store supported the possibility that someone had entered the business intending to steal property, with the situation later escalating into a deadly crime. However, investigators also considered another possibility: that the appearance of a robbery had been created to hide a different motive. Because the crime scene had been affected by fire, authorities could not immediately determine whether the missing money represented the true purpose of the crime or whether it was part of an attempt to mislead investigators. The early investigation therefore proceeded without a single confirmed explanation. Detectives began collecting information from every available source. Over time, investigators interviewed thousands of witnesses, reviewed numerous leads, and examined hundreds of potential suspects. The process required careful evaluation because the case did not initially provide a simple connection between a specific individual and the crime scene. The surviving physical evidence became especially important. Investigators collected fingerprints, biological samples, and other materials that remained available after the fire. Each piece of evidence was examined in an attempt to determine whether it could provide information about who had been inside the store. However, the scientific tools available at the time created additional limitations. In 1991, DNA analysis was still developing. Although biological evidence could be collected, forensic technology had not yet reached the level of precision available decades later. Some samples recovered from the scene were too limited or unsuitable for identification using the methods available at the time. This meant that investigators had evidence, but not necessarily answers. The biological material collected during the investigation would later become significant because it could be preserved and re-examined as scientific methods improved. At the time, however, these samples could not provide investigators with the identification they needed. The limitations of forensic science forced investigators to rely heavily on traditional investigative methods. Interviews, witness information, and the examination of possible suspects became essential parts of the process. The case also required investigators to carefully separate confirmed facts from assumptions. The known facts were that 4 young women were found dead inside the yogurt shop, the store had been searched, money was missing, and the building had been intentionally burned. Beyond those facts, many questions remained unanswered. Who had entered the store after closing? What was the purpose of the fire? Was the missing money the motive, or was it part of a larger attempt to create a false impression? The absence of definitive answers meant that the investigation continued in multiple directions. As months turned into years, the case remained active. Investigators continued reviewing information and following leads. The The large number of interviews and potential suspects reflected the complexity of the investigation rather than the presence of a clear solution. The passage of time created additional difficulties. Memories could become less reliable, witnesses could become harder to locate, and the original circumstances of the investigation became increasingly distant. However, the evidence collected during the early stages remained preserved, allowing future investigators the possibility of reviewing the case with improved methods. By the late 1990s, after years of investigation, attention began to focus on 4 local men: Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. The involvement of these 4 individuals marked a significant change in the direction of the case. After years without a final resolution, investigators believed they had identified people who might be connected to the events at the yogurt shop. 2 of the men later provided statements that included confessions. These statements became a major part of the prosecution's case in the years that followed. However, questions about the circumstances surrounding those statements would eventually become central to later legal proceedings. The other 2 men denied involvement in the crime. Additionally, the accounts provided by the suspects contained inconsistencies, and some details did not correspond with the physical evidence available from the crime scene. These differences would become increasingly important as the case moved from investigation to prosecution. The early investigative phase of the yogurt shop murders demonstrates the challenges involved in solving a case where the physical scene has been severely compromised. Investigators worked with limited evidence, developing forensic technology and multiple possible explanations for what had occurred. Despite the difficulties, the investigation continued. Evidence was preserved. Records were maintained. New legal and scientific developments would later lead to a reassessment of important conclusions that had been reached during the earlier stages of the case. The investigation was entering a new period, one defined not only by questions of responsibility, but also by questions about the reliability of evidence, the accuracy of confessions, and the ability of the justice system to reconsider earlier findings when new information became available. By the late 1990s, the investigation into the yogurt shop murders had entered a new and significant phase. For several years, law enforcement agencies had continued examining evidence, following leads, and reviewing information connected to the deaths of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. The case remained unresolved, but investigators continued searching for individuals who could be connected to the events that had occurred inside the Austin yogurt shop in December 1991. During this period, attention turned toward 4 local men: Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. Their names became central to the investigation and later to the criminal proceedings that followed. After years of uncertainty, authorities believed they had identified individuals who might have information about the crime. The case against these men developed around statements made during the investigation, particularly statements from 2 of the suspects that were interpreted as confessions. These admissions became an important part of the prosecution's theory and would eventually influence the direction of the legal proceedings. However, from the beginning, questions existed regarding the reliability and accuracy of these statements. The investigation had already been complicated by the condition of the original crime scene. The fire had destroyed or weakened significant evidence, and the forensic technology available in 1991 had limited investigators' ability to identify individuals through biological evidence. Because of these limitations, statements made by suspects became especially important in attempting to establish what had happened inside the yogurt shop. 2 of the 4 men provided statements that implicated themselves in the crime. However, the circumstances surrounding these statements later became a major issue of legal review. Questions were raised about the methods used during questioning and whether the information contained in the confessions accurately matched the known evidence. The other 2 men denied involvement in the killings. As investigators compared the different accounts, inconsistencies began to emerge. The statements provided by the suspects did not completely agree with one another, and certain details did not correspond with the physical evidence collected from the crime scene. These conflicts became increasingly important because the prosecution's case relied heavily on establishing a connection between the accused men and the events that occurred inside the yogurt shop. A criminal investigation depends not only on identifying possible suspects, but also on demonstrating that the available evidence supports the conclusion that those suspects were responsible. In the yogurt shop murders, the relationship between the statements, the physical evidence, and the circumstances of the crime would later become the focus of intense examination. The legal process began with the belief that the investigation had identified those responsible. However, as the case moved forward, the evidence and the reliability of the original conclusions would be questioned. The first major trial involved Robert Springsteen. In 2001, Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction represented a significant moment in the long-running investigation because it appeared to provide a legal resolution to one part of the case. The following year, Michael Scott was also convicted in connection with the murders. Like Springsteen, Scott's conviction was based on the prosecution's presentation of evidence linking him to the crime. For the victims' families and the Austin community, these convictions appeared to offer progress after years of uncertainty. However, the legal conclusions reached during these trials would later face significant challenges. As the appeals process developed, courts began examining issues surrounding the original investigation and prosecution. The focus turned toward whether important information had been properly considered and whether the confessions used during the trials could be considered reliable. One of the central concerns involved the statements obtained from the suspects. A confession can be powerful evidence in a criminal case, but its value depends on whether the statement accurately reflects the truth and whether it is consistent with other evidence. In this case, later reviews identified problems with the way the confessions were obtained and with the relationship between those statements and the available forensic information. The legal challenges also examined whether important evidence had been fully presented during the original proceedings. As the case was reviewed, questions emerged about whether the trials had included all relevant information necessary for a complete evaluation. The developments surrounding the appeals changed the understanding of the case. What had once appeared to be a completed prosecution became an example of the difficulties involved when criminal investigations rely on evidence that later becomes disputed. The yogurt shop murders became increasingly associated with broader questions about the reliability of confessions, the importance of forensic evidence, and the responsibility of the justice system to reconsider previous conclusions when new information becomes available. The case demonstrated that a conviction is not always the final stage of a criminal investigation. Courts must continue examining whether evidence remains reliable and whether legal decisions were reached through fair and accurate procedures. As the appeals process continued, the original convictions were challenged. The courts determined that significant issues existed regarding the handling of the case, including problems related to the confessions and the presentation of evidence. These developments eventually led to the overturning of the convictions. The reversal of the convictions did not immediately solve the mystery of what happened at the yogurt shop. Instead, it created a new stage in the investigation. The question was no longer only whether the four men had been responsible. It also became necessary to reconsider the evidence that had led authorities to them in the first place. The case returned to the central challenge that had existed since 1991. Determining the truth from incomplete and complicated evidence. The scientific evidence became increasingly important during this period. As forensic technology improved, investigators were able to examine biological material collected years earlier. The DNA evidence that had once been limited by the technology of the early 1990s could now be studied using more advanced methods. Those developments would eventually have a major impact on how the case was viewed. Testing showed that DNA evidence from the crime scene did not match Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. These findings significantly weakened the theory that the four men were responsible for the crime. The new forensic information created a conflict between the earlier legal conclusions and the later scientific evidence. A case that had once resulted in convictions now required another careful examination of the facts. Ultimately, prosecutors did not continue pursuing the four men in connection with the murders. The individuals who had once been central figures in the prosecution were no longer considered responsible under the legal system. The developments surrounding the suspects marked one of the most important turning points in the history of the yogurt shop murders. The case demonstrated how criminal investigations can change over time as new evidence becomes available and as scientific methods develop. For more than 3 decades, the investigation would continue to evolve. The original crime scene remained the foundation of the case, but the interpretation of that evidence changed as technology and legal review provided new information. The story of the yogurt shop murders was no longer only about identifying suspects. It had also become a case about the importance of reliable evidence, the limitations of early investigations, and the need to continue searching for answers even when previous conclusions are challenged. The next stage of the investigation would focus on the role of DNA technology and how scientific advances would reshape the understanding of one of Texas's most complex cold cases. The investigation into the yogurt shop murders entered a new stage when the case moved from police investigation to criminal prosecution. After years of searching for answers, authorities had identified 4 men as suspects: Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. The legal proceedings that followed would become one of the most debated parts of the case because the evidence presented in court would later be questioned, reviewed, and reconsidered. The prosecutions were built around the belief that the 4 men were connected to the deaths of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison. 2 of the suspects had provided statements that prosecutors considered confessions. These statements became central elements of the case, especially because the physical evidence from the original crime scene had been significantly affected by the fire and because forensic technology at the time had not produced a definitive identification. In criminal cases, prosecutors must demonstrate that the evidence presented establishes responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. In the yogurt shop murders, the legal arguments focused heavily on the interpretation of the available evidence, including the statements made by the suspects and the information collected during the investigation. Robert Springsteen was the first of the 4 men to face trial. In 2001, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction represented a major development after nearly a decade of investigation. For many observers, the trial appeared to bring a sense of resolution to a case that had remained unanswered for many years. However, the conviction did not end the legal questions surrounding the investigation. The evidence used during the trial would later become the subject of further examination. In particular, the role of the confession and the circumstances surrounding how it was obtained became increasingly important. Questions were raised about whether the statements accurately reflected the events at the yogurt shop and whether they were consistent with the physical evidence. The following year, Michael Scott was also tried and convicted. His conviction represented another significant moment in the prosecution of the case. Like Springsteen's case, the prosecution relied on evidence gathered during the investigation, including statements that authorities considered important in connecting him to the crime. For several years, the convictions of Springsteen and Scott represented the official legal outcome of the case. However, as appeals continued, courts began examining whether the original proceedings had fully considered all relevant issues. The appeals process is a fundamental part of the legal system because it allows courts to review whether mistakes may have affected the outcome of a trial. In the yogurt shop murders case, the appeals focused on problems involving the confessions and the presentation of evidence. One of the major issues was the reliability of the statements made by the suspects. A confession can play an important role in a criminal prosecution, but its value depends on whether it is supported by independent evidence and whether the information contained within it accurately matches known facts. In this case, later reviews found significant concerns regarding the statements that had contributed to the convictions. The courts examined whether the methods used during questioning and the information obtained from those interviews met the standards required for a fair legal process. Another issue involved evidence that had not been fully presented during the original trials. A criminal case depends on a complete evaluation of all relevant information. When important evidence is missing from consideration, questions can arise about whether the court had access to the full picture when reaching its decision. As these legal challenges developed, the earlier conclusions of the investigation came under increasing scrutiny. The case also became connected to broader discussions about wrongful convictions and the challenges of relying heavily on disputed confessions. The yogurt shop murders demonstrated how complicated criminal cases can become when evidence collected during an investigation is later viewed differently through legal review and scientific advancement. The passage of time played an important role in the reassessment of the case. The original investigation had taken place during a period when DNA technology was far less advanced than it would become in later decades. Evidence that could not provide clear answers in the 1990s could later be examined using improved forensic methods. As the legal process continued, DNA evidence became increasingly significant. Testing of biological material recovered from the crime scene showed that the DNA evidence did not match Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. The legal consequences of these developments were significant. The convictions of Springsteen and Scott were overturned. The earlier judgments that had connected them to the murders could no longer stand after the courts identified problems with the proceedings and the evidence involved. The reversal of the convictions did not mean that the mystery surrounding the murders had been solved. Instead, it reopened fundamental questions that had existed since the beginning of the investigation. Who was responsible for the deaths of the 4 teenagers? What happened inside the yogurt shop after closing? How should the surviving evidence be interpreted? These questions remained unanswered. The 4 men who had once been accused were no longer legally responsible for the crime. The evidence that had once supported their prosecution had been weakened by later forensic findings. Prosecutors ultimately did not continue pursuing the case against them. The developments surrounding the trials represented a major turning point. The focus shifted away from the question of proving the guilt of the original suspects and toward understanding what the evidence actually showed. The yogurt shop murders became an example of how criminal investigations can change over time. Evidence that appears convincing at one point may later be reconsidered as new information becomes available. Scientific progress, legal review, and careful examination of previous conclusions can all influence the way a case is understood. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence. Although the fire had damaged much of the original crime scene, some biological evidence survived and remained available for later testing. This preservation allowed future investigators to examine the case with tools that did not exist when the crime originally occurred. By the time the convictions were overturned, the investigation had already lasted for more than a decade. However, the case was far from finished. The questions surrounding the deaths of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison remained unresolved. The legal proceedings had answered one question. The earlier convictions could not stand. But they did not answer the larger question that had defined the investigation from the beginning. Who was responsible for the crime? The case entered another uncertain period. Investigators now had to reconsider evidence without relying on the earlier conclusions. The advances in DNA analysis offered a new possibility that science might provide answers that had not been available before. The next phase of the yogurt shop murders investigation would focus on the continued examination of forensic evidence and the role that modern technology would play in reshaping the understanding of the case. More than 30 years after the events at the Austin yogurt shop, the investigation would demonstrate how advances in science could reopen questions that had remained unanswered for decades. After the convictions of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were overturned, the yogurt shop murders entered another important stage. The legal outcomes had changed the direction of the investigation, but they did not provide an answer to the central question that had remained unresolved since December 1991. Who was responsible for the deaths of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison? The reversal of the convictions forced investigators, prosecutors, and legal authorities to examine the case from a different perspective. The original theory that had connected 4 men to the crime was weakened by new findings, and the evidence collected decades earlier had to be reviewed again with greater attention. One of the most important developments was the continued examination of biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. When the yogurt shop murders occurred in 1991, DNA technology was still developing. Investigators were able to collect biological material, but the available scientific methods were limited compared with the techniques that would become available years later. The evidence that could not provide a clear answer in the early stages of the investigation remained preserved. As forensic science advanced, investigators gained the ability to analyze old evidence in ways that had not been possible when the case first began. This process changed the understanding of the investigation. DNA testing eventually showed that biological evidence collected from the crime scene did not match Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. These results became a significant factor in evaluating the previous prosecution of the four men. The findings did not identify the person responsible at that stage, but they created an important conclusion. The available DNA evidence did not support the idea that these four individuals were the source of the biological material connected to the crime scene. This development further weakened the original case against them. The importance of DNA evidence in the yogurt shop murders was connected to the broader evolution of forensic science. In the early 1990s, investigators often had to work with limited scientific tools. Biological samples could be collected and stored, but the ability to compare those samples to specific individuals was not as advanced as it would become later. By the time new testing methods became available, the investigation had already lasted for many years. The preserved evidence represented a connection between the original crime scene and modern forensic technology. It allowed investigators to return to questions that had remained unanswered since the beginning of the case. The reassessment of DNA evidence also demonstrated the importance of maintaining physical evidence in unresolved investigations. Even when evidence cannot immediately provide answers, future scientific developments may create new opportunities for analysis. For the yogurt shop murders, this principle became especially important because the original crime scene had been severely damaged by fire. The destruction of evidence had limited investigators from the beginning, but the survival of some biological material allowed later examination. The case therefore entered a period in which scientific progress became central to the search for answers. At the same time, the legal status of the four previously accused men changed significantly. After the convictions were overturned and DNA evidence did not match them, they were no longer considered responsible for the crime under the legal system. The prosecutions against them ended, and attention returned to identifying the person or people responsible for the deaths. The developments surrounding DNA evidence also influenced public understanding of the case. For many years, the convictions had represented the official explanation of what happened. However, later findings demonstrated that criminal investigations can change when new evidence becomes available. The case became an example of how scientific evidence can challenge earlier conclusions and how the justice system must remain open to reviewing previous decisions. The investigation continued as a cold case. Authorities maintained the case files, preserved available evidence, and continued examining possible leads. The passage of time did not eliminate the importance of the original evidence or the responsibility to continue searching for answers. As technology developed further, investigators began exploring more advanced methods of DNA analysis. These methods allowed scientists to examine genetic information in greater detail and compare biological evidence using approaches that were not available during the original investigation. One of these developments involved genetic genealogy, a method that uses genetic information to help identify possible relationships between unknown DNA samples and individuals connected through family lines. In the yogurt shop murders investigation, advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy became part of the continuing effort to identify a possible source of the unidentified biological evidence. The work represented a new phase in the investigation, combining preserved evidence from 1991 with scientific tools developed decades later. By the 2024 to 2026 period, investigators working with advanced forensic methods identified a strong investigative lead connected to a deceased man. This development represented a significant change in the direction of the case. However, authorities emphasized that an investigative lead was not the same as a criminal conviction or a judicial determination. Because the individual identified through this process was no longer alive, the legal process could not proceed in the same way as it would in a case involving a living suspect. The significance of the DNA development was not that it immediately closed the case, but that it provided investigators with new information after more than 3 decades of uncertainty. It also reinforced the importance of distinguishing between evidence, investigative conclusions, and legal judgments. A DNA connection may guide investigators toward a possible explanation, But criminal responsibility requires a complete legal process and sufficient evidence. The yogurt shop murders remained officially open as a cold case. The new forensic developments narrowed the direction of the investigation, but they did not result in a final criminal conviction. For the families of the victims, the continuing investigation represented both progress and the reality that many questions remained unanswered. The deaths of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison had led to decades of searching, reviewing, and reconsidering evidence. The case also continued to influence discussions about criminal investigations more broadly. It demonstrated the consequences of damaged crime scenes, the risks of relying heavily on disputed evidence, and the importance of allowing scientific methods to evolve over time. The history of the yogurt shop murders showed that investigations do not always follow a direct path. Evidence can be interpreted differently as new information becomes available. Conclusions reached in one period may later be reconsidered through legal review or scientific advancement. The case moved from an investigation shaped by a damaged crime scene and limited forensic technology to one influenced by modern DNA analysis. The passage of more than 30 years did not erase the evidence that remained. Instead, it allowed new methods to examine that evidence in ways that investigators in 1991 could not have imagined. The continuing investigation reflected a broader principle of modern criminal justice. Unresolved cases may remain active because evidence can gain new meaning over time. For the yogurt shop murders, DNA technology did not provide every answer, but it changed the direction of the search. It helped eliminate earlier assumptions, confirmed that the 4 previously accused men did not match the key biological evidence, and provided investigators with a new path to follow. The case remained one of Texas's most significant cold cases, not only because of the tragedy that occurred inside the yogurt shop, but because of the decades-long effort to understand what the evidence truly revealed. More than 30 years after the fire at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, the investigation continued to demonstrate both the difficulties and possibilities of modern forensic science. The evidence collected after that December night remained central to the search for truth, and advances in technology continued to offer opportunities to examine unanswered questions that had remained for generations. The yogurt shop murders remain one of the most significant unresolved criminal investigations in Texas because the case represented the difficulties that can arise when evidence, technology, and legal decisions change over time. More than 3 decades after the events at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt store in Austin, the investigation continued to be examined not only because of the deaths of 4 teenagers, but also because of the many questions that surrounded the search for answers. The victims of the case, Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, remained at the center of every stage of the investigation. Although the legal proceedings and forensic developments changed the direction of the case over the years, the purpose of the investigation remained the same: to determine what happened inside the yogurt shop after closing and to identify those responsible. The passage of time created both challenges and opportunities. A case that remains unresolved for decades can become increasingly difficult to investigate. Witness memories may become less clear, information may become harder to verify, and circumstances surrounding the original investigation may change. However, the preservation of evidence can allow investigators to return to a case when new scientific methods become available. The yogurt shop murders became an example of this process. From the beginning, the investigation was affected by the intentional fire that damaged the crime scene. The fire created immediate obstacles because it destroyed or weakened evidence that might have helped investigators understand the sequence of events. The condition of the location meant that authorities had to rely on whatever information survived, rather than having access to a complete record of what had occurred. The limitations of forensic science in 1991 also influenced the investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was not capable of providing the level of identification that modern technology can achieve. Biological evidence existed, but the ability to interpret that evidence was limited. As forensic science advanced, the importance of preserving evidence became increasingly clear. Materials that had once provided limited information could later become valuable sources of new investigative leads. This transformation was one of the most important developments in the history of the case. The later DNA findings changed the understanding of the investigation. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene did not match Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. These results contributed to the end of the legal proceedings against the four men and reinforced that the earlier prosecutions could not provide a final resolution. The developments also highlighted the difference between a criminal accusation and a proven conclusion. The legal system requires evidence that can withstand examination, and when new information changes the interpretation of existing evidence, previous conclusions must be reconsidered. The yogurt shop murders became closely associated with this principle. The case demonstrated that investigations are not always defined by the first explanation that appears possible. Instead, they require continuous evaluation as additional information becomes available. The later use of advanced DNA analysis represented a significant step forward. Through improved forensic methods, investigators were able to examine biological evidence with greater precision. The introduction of genetic genealogy provided another tool for analyzing unidentified DNA and exploring possible connections. By the 2024 to 2026 period, these methods produced a new investigative lead connected to a deceased individual. The development represented progress after many years without a definitive answer. However, authorities continued to distinguish between an investigative lead and a legal conclusion. The information provided direction for investigators, but it did not result in a criminal conviction. This distinction remained important because the purpose of a criminal investigation is not only to identify possibilities, but to establish facts through evidence that meets legal standards. The continuing investigation also reflected the broader changes in criminal justice over the decades. Advances in technology, improved forensic methods, and increased understanding of investigative procedures have changed how older cases are examined. The yogurt shop murders demonstrated how a case can evolve. In the early years, investigators worked with a damaged crime scene and limited scientific resources. Later, courts examined the reliability of statements and evidence. Eventually, modern DNA technology created new opportunities to review information collected decades earlier. Each stage contributed to a more complete understanding of the case, even though a final criminal conviction was never reached. For the Austin community, the case remained a reminder of the importance of unresolved investigations and the lasting impact on families affected by violent crimes. The passage of time did not reduce the significance of the victims' lives or the importance of finding answers. The investigation also became part of broader discussions about forensic reliability. The case showed how evidence must be carefully evaluated and how conclusions can change when new scientific information becomes available. The problems associated with disputed confessions and the later DNA findings contributed to conversations about the need for accurate investigative procedures and careful legal review. The history of the yogurt shop murders also demonstrated the importance of maintaining evidence over long periods. Without preserved biological material, later DNA analysis would not have been possible. The ability to revisit old evidence allowed investigators to challenge earlier assumptions and explore new possibilities. This principle has influenced many cold case investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible to solve have sometimes gained new investigative opportunities because scientific methods have continued to develop. However, scientific advancement does not guarantee immediate resolution. DNA can provide important information, but investigators must still interpret that information within the broader context of the case. Evidence must be connected to timelines, circumstances, and other verified facts before a complete conclusion can be reached. The yogurt shop murders continued to reflect this reality. The DNA developments provided significant information, but questions about the full circumstances of the crime remained. The case remained technically open. Although the investigation had progressed significantly compared with earlier decades, no final prosecution had resulted in a conviction for the deaths of the four victims. The unresolved nature of the case made it one of the most recognized cold cases in Texas. Its history included an initial investigation complicated by a destroyed crime scene, prosecutions that were later challenged, convictions that were overturned, and scientific developments that changed the understanding of the evidence. The case also demonstrated the importance of allowing investigations to continue beyond the limits of the technology available at the time a crime occurs. The investigators working in 1991 could only use the tools available to them. Later investigators benefited from decades of scientific progress. The connection between past evidence and modern technology became one of the defining features of the investigation. The story of the yogurt shop murders was ultimately a story about persistence. The case continued because evidence was preserved, because legal decisions could be reviewed, and because scientific methods continued to improve. Each new development offered the possibility of understanding more about what happened inside the store on that December night. For the families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, the search for answers remained the central concern. The investigation continued not because of public attention alone, but because 4 lives were lost and the circumstances surrounding their deaths had never received a final legal resolution. More than 30 years after the fire at the Austin yogurt shop, the case remained a significant example of the challenges faced by long-term criminal investigations. It showed how evidence can be damaged, misunderstood, reconsidered, and eventually analyzed through new methods. The future of the investigation depended on continued examination of evidence, careful evaluation of new information, and the ongoing work of authorities seeking a complete understanding of the events that occurred in 1991. The yogurt shop murders remained an unresolved chapter in Texas criminal history, but it also demonstrated the continuing importance of forensic science, evidence preservation, and the commitment to revisit difficult cases when new opportunities for discovery emerge. The yogurt shop murders became one of the most closely examined criminal investigations in Texas, not only because of the events that occurred inside the Austin yogurt shop, but also because of the many stages through which the case passed over more than 3 decades. The investigation reflected the challenges of pursuing justice when evidence is damaged, technology changes, and earlier conclusions must be reconsidered. From the beginning, the case was defined by uncertainty. Investigators knew that 4 teenagers had been found inside the "I can't believe it's yogurt" store after a fire was reported on the night of December 6, 1991. They knew that the fire had been intentionally set, that the store appeared to have been searched, and that money had been taken from the cash register. However, many of the details needed to create a complete explanation were never immediately available. The destruction caused by the fire shaped the investigation in a fundamental way. A crime scene provides investigators with information about what happened, but in this case, much of that information had already been altered or lost before examination began. The fire damaged physical evidence and created difficulties that investigators had to overcome from the earliest hours. This challenge remained present throughout the history of the case. The investigation showed the importance of carefully preserving evidence, even when that evidence cannot immediately provide answers. In 1991, some biological material collected from the scene could not be used to identify a person because forensic technology was still developing. However, those same samples later became important when scientific methods improved. The ability to return to old evidence demonstrated how criminal investigations can change over time. Evidence is not always limited by what can be discovered at the moment it is collected. Advances in science can provide new information decades later. The legal history of the case also became an important part of its significance. The prosecutions of Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen resulted in convictions, but those convictions were later overturned after courts identified problems involving the evidence and the confessions used during the proceedings. The reversal of those convictions represented a major change in the public understanding of the case. It showed that a legal outcome is not necessarily the final word in an investigation. When new information emerges, earlier conclusions may require additional review. The case also demonstrated the importance of evaluating confessions carefully. Statements made during investigations can be significant, but they must be examined alongside other evidence. A confession alone does not remove the need for independent verification. In the yogurt shop murders, questions surrounding the confessions became central because some details did not correspond with the known evidence. Later DNA testing further challenged the connection between the accused men and the crime scene. The DNA findings represented one of the most important developments in the investigation. Testing showed that biological evidence from the scene did not match Scott, Springsteen, Pierce, or Wellborn. These results contributed to the end of the prosecutions against them and changed the direction of the investigation. The significance of these findings extended beyond this individual case. They demonstrated how forensic science can help correct earlier assumptions and provide a more accurate understanding of evidence. Modern DNA technology also changed the way investigators approach the remaining questions. Instead of relying only on traditional investigative methods, authorities were able to use advanced analysis techniques to examine biological evidence that had remained unresolved for decades. The use of genetic genealogy represented another major development in the evolution of the case. This method provided investigators with new ways to analyze unidentified DNA and search for possible connections that could not have been discovered through earlier methods. By the 2024 to 2026 period, advanced DNA analysis produced an investigative lead connected to a deceased individual. The information represented a significant development because it narrowed the focus of the investigation after many years without a clear direction. However, the case also demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between an investigative finding and a legal conclusion. A lead may guide investigators, but a complete criminal case requires evidence that can meet legal standards. Because the identified individual was deceased, the process could not result in a traditional criminal prosecution. Authorities continued to treat the information as an investigative development rather than a final judicial determination. This distinction reflected one of the central themes of the yogurt shop murders: the difference between discovering information and establishing legal responsibility. The investigation also raised broader questions about how society understands unresolved cases. A cold case is not simply a case that has been forgotten. It represents an investigation that remains open because important questions have not yet been answered. The yogurt shop murders remained active because the need for answers continued. The families of the victims continued to seek a complete understanding of what happened, and investigators continued examining evidence that could provide additional information. The case also demonstrated the lasting importance of the victims themselves. While much attention has focused on investigations, trials, and forensic developments, the foundation of the case remained the lives of 4 young people who died inside the yogurt shop. Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison were teenagers whose lives ended during an ordinary evening that became the beginning of a decades-long investigation. The continuing effort to understand the case was ultimately connected to recognizing the importance of those lives and the impact of their deaths on their families and community. The history of the investigation also offered lessons about the criminal justice system. It showed that investigations must be flexible enough to incorporate new evidence, and that legal conclusions must remain open to review when significant questions arise. The case illustrated both the strengths and limitations of the justice system. Investigators worked with the information and technology available at each stage, but later developments showed that some earlier conclusions required reconsideration. The importance of scientific advancement became especially clear. DNA technology changed not only the yogurt shop murders investigation, but also many other cold cases around the world. Evidence once considered limited could later provide valuable information. At the same time, the case demonstrated that technology alone cannot answer every question. Scientific evidence must still be interpreted carefully and combined with other verified information. Investigators must consider the entire context of a case rather than relying on one piece of evidence alone. The yogurt shop murders remained a reminder that complex investigations require patience and accuracy. The search for answers may continue for years or decades, but preserved evidence and improved methods can create new possibilities. More than 30 years after the events at the Austin yogurt shop, the investigation continued to represent both the difficulty of solving complex crimes and the possibility that new information may emerge in the future. The case was shaped by tragedy, uncertainty, legal challenges, and scientific progress. It moved through different periods of investigation, from the initial response to the fire, through prosecutions and overturned convictions, and eventually into an era of advanced DNA analysis. Each stage changed the understanding of what was known and what remained unknown. the yogurt shop murders continued to stand as one of Texas's most significant cold cases because it represented many of the challenges faced by modern criminal investigations. A damaged crime scene, limited early technology, disputed evidence, and changing scientific methods all influenced the course of the case. Yet the investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence. Evidence collected decades earlier could still provide information. Legal decisions could be reconsidered. Scientific progress could create new opportunities. The search for answers remained unfinished, but the case continued to show why unresolved investigations are preserved and revisited. Behind every piece of evidence, every legal decision, and every scientific development were 4 victims whose deaths continued to matter. The history of the yogurt shop murders was not only about an unsolved crime. It was also about the continuing effort to understand the truth, the responsibility to evaluate evidence carefully, and the belief that even the most difficult investigations deserve continued attention. The yogurt shop murders remained an open chapter in Texas criminal history because, despite decades of investigation and significant advances in forensic science, the case never reached a final legal conclusion. The deaths of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison continued to represent a search for answers that involved investigators, courts, scientists, and the families of the victims. The investigation changed significantly over time. What began as a crime scene examination in 1991 became a long-term effort shaped by changing technology, legal review, and new interpretations of evidence. Each stage of the investigation added information, but it also revealed new questions that required careful examination. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, investigators faced the challenge of understanding a crime scene that had been severely damaged. The deliberate burning of the yogurt shop affected the physical evidence and made it more difficult to determine the sequence of events. The investigation had to begin with incomplete information. The early focus was on identifying what had happened inside the store after closing. Investigators examined the available evidence, interviewed witnesses, and considered different explanations for the crime. The missing money and the condition of the store led authorities to consider whether the incident involved a robbery. At the same time, the possibility that the robbery appearance had been created to hide another motive also remained part of the investigation. Without a complete physical record, investigators had to carefully evaluate every piece of available information. As years passed, the case demonstrated how difficult it can be to solve crimes when evidence is limited. The original investigation took place during a period when DNA analysis was still developing. Biological evidence could be collected, but the ability to identify individuals through DNA was far more restricted than it would become in later decades. The preservation of evidence became one of the most important factors in the future of the case. Although the original investigation could not fully use all available biological evidence, keeping those materials allowed later investigators to apply improved scientific methods. This process changed the investigation. The later DNA analysis showed that the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene did not match Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. These findings had significant consequences because they challenged the conclusions reached during the earlier prosecution. The legal system had already moved through trials and convictions, but the new scientific information demonstrated the importance of continuing to evaluate evidence. The results did not immediately identify the person responsible, but they helped clarify what the evidence did not show. The 4 men who had once been prosecuted were no longer connected to the case through legal responsibility. The convictions were overturned, and the remaining evidence did not support continuing prosecution against them. This development represented an important moment in the history of the investigation. It showed that criminal cases can change as new information becomes available, and that the search for accuracy must continue even after legal decisions have been made. The case also became an example of the relationship between science and the justice system. Scientific methods continue to evolve, and evidence collected decades earlier may gain new significance when examined with improved technology. The introduction of advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy created new possibilities for cold case investigations. These methods allowed investigators to examine unidentified biological evidence in ways that were not possible when the original crime occurred. For the yogurt shop murders, these developments provided a new direction. After more than 30 years, investigators were able to identify a strong investigative lead connected to a deceased individual through modern forensic methods. However, the significance of this development required careful interpretation. An investigative lead is not the same as a criminal conviction. It can guide authorities toward a possible explanation, but a complete legal conclusion requires evidence that meets the standards of the justice system. Because the individual connected to the DNA lead had already died, the investigation could not proceed through a traditional criminal trial. Authorities continued to describe the finding as an important investigative development rather than a final judicial resolution. This distinction reflected the complexity of the case. The goal of an investigation is not simply to identify a possible explanation, but to establish the facts as accurately as possible. The yogurt shop murders also demonstrated how the passage of time can influence investigations. Decades after a crime occurs, circumstances may change, but evidence can continue to provide information. Modern forensic techniques have allowed investigators to revisit cases that once appeared impossible to resolve. The case became part of a larger movement in law enforcement toward the use of advanced forensic technology in cold cases. Across the United States, preserved evidence has allowed investigators to reopen old investigations and explore possibilities that were unavailable to earlier generations. However, technology remains only one part of the process. Investigators must still examine evidence carefully, verify information, and consider the entire history of a case. Scientific results must be interpreted within the broader context of known facts. The yogurt shop murder showed that solving a complex case requires more than one breakthrough. It requires the combination of evidence, investigation, legal review, and scientific advancement. The impact of the case extended beyond the investigation itself. It influenced discussions about the reliability of confessions, the importance of forensic evidence, and the need for careful review of criminal convictions. The legal challenges surrounding the original prosecutions became a significant part of the case's history. The overturned convictions demonstrated the importance of ensuring that evidence presented in court is reliable and complete. The case also emphasized the importance of protecting the rights of individuals accused of crimes while continuing the search for justice for victims. A criminal investigation must serve both purposes, holding responsible individuals accountable while ensuring that conclusions are based on accurate and reliable evidence. For the families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, the investigation represented decades of waiting for answers. The passage of time did not remove the significance of their loss or the importance of understanding what happened. The victims remained the central reason the investigation continued. Behind every forensic development and every legal decision were 4 young lives that ended during an ordinary evening at a local business. The yogurt shop murders remained significant because they represented the challenges of seeking justice in a case where the evidence was complicated and the answers were not immediate. The investigation showed that some cases required decades of work and multiple generations of investigators before meaningful progress can be made. By 2026, the case had not reached a final courtroom resolution. However, it had changed dramatically from the early years. The original suspects had been removed from legal responsibility. DNA evidence had reshaped the investigation, and modern forensic methods had created new possibilities. The case continued to remain open technically, reflecting the fact that the investigation was not considered complete. Authorities continued to preserve evidence and examine information that could contribute to understanding the events of December 1991. The history of the yogurt shop murders demonstrated that cold cases are not static. They continue to develop as new evidence emerges and as technology changes. A case that appears unsolvable at one point may later provide new opportunities for discovery. The investigation also represented the importance of patience and persistence. More than 3 decades had passed since the fire at the yogurt shop, yet the search for answers continued. The story of the case was ultimately defined by uncertainty, but also by continued effort. Investigators returned to evidence that had once seemed limited. Courts reviewed earlier decisions. Scientists applied new methods to old materials. Each step contributed to a deeper understanding of what was known and what remained unresolved. The yogurt shop murders remained one of Texas's most notable cold cases because it reflected both the difficulties and possibilities of modern criminal investigation. It showed how evidence can be damaged, challenged, reconsidered, and eventually examined through new scientific approaches. Although many questions remained unanswered, the investigation continued to demonstrate the importance of preserving evidence, reviewing conclusions carefully, and maintaining the commitment to finding the truth for victims and their families. More than 3 decades after the events at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt store in Austin, the yogurt shop murders remained one of the most significant cold cases in Texas history. The investigation had passed through multiple stages, from the discovery of the fire in December 1991, through years of searching for suspects, through criminal trials and overturned convictions, and finally into a new era defined by advanced forensic technology. The case never followed a simple path. From the beginning, investigators faced uncertainty. For teenagers had lost their lives inside a local business after closing hours. The building had been damaged by an intentional fire. Important evidence had been affected, and the available scientific tools of the time were limited. The questions that emerged in those first days continued to define the investigation for decades. What exactly happened inside the yogurt shop after closing? Was the missing money evidence of a robbery that escalated into a deadly crime? Or was the appearance of a robbery created to hide another purpose? These questions remained central because the evidence available from the original crime scene could not immediately provide complete answers. The investigation began with the facts that were known. Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison were found inside the store after firefighters responded to the report of a fire. The store showed signs of being searched, money had been taken from the cash register, and the fire had been intentionally set. Beyond those facts, investigators had to reconstruct events from incomplete information. The difficulties of the case demonstrated the challenges of criminal investigations when evidence is damaged or limited. The fire created obstacles that affected the collection and interpretation of physical evidence. Some information that might have helped investigators understand the crime was lost or weakened before it could be fully examined. Despite those challenges, investigators continued working to identify those responsible. The case eventually focused on 4 men: Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. The investigation reached a point where authorities believed they had identified individuals connected to the crime. 2 of the men provided statements that prosecutors considered confessions, and those statements became an important part of the legal proceedings. The resulting trials produced convictions. Robert Springsteen was convicted in 2001, and Michael Scott was convicted in 2002. At that time, the legal system had reached conclusions based on the evidence available during the trials. However, the case did not end there. As appeals moved forward, questions emerged about the reliability of the confessions and the way evidence had been presented. Courts examined whether important issues had been properly considered and whether the original proceedings had provided a complete understanding of the available information. The later review of the case showed the importance of continuing to evaluate evidence, even after a conviction has been reached. The justice system depends on the ability to reconsider decisions when significant questions arise. DNA evidence became one of the most important factors in changing the direction of the investigation. When the crime occurred in 1991, DNA technology was not advanced enough to provide the answers that modern methods can produce. However, biological evidence collected from the scene was preserved, allowing later scientists to examine it using improved techniques. The results showed that the DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene did not match Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. These findings changed the understanding of the case. The evidence did not support the conclusion that these 4 men were the source of the biological material connected to the crime scene. The convictions were overturned, and the men were no longer considered legally responsible for the murders. This development represented a major moment in the history of the investigation. It demonstrated how scientific progress can challenge earlier conclusions and how new evidence can change the direction of a case. The yogurt shop murders became an example of why evidence must be preserved and why investigations must remain open to new information. The later use of advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy created another important chapter. These methods allowed investigators to examine unidentified biological evidence with tools that did not exist when the case first began. By the 2024 to 2026 period, these techniques produced an investigative lead connected to a deceased individual. The development represented progress after many years without a definitive answer. However, the investigation also demonstrated the importance of separating evidence from conclusions. A DNA lead can provide investigators with valuable information, but it does not automatically establish criminal responsibility. Legal responsibility requires a complete process based on evidence that meets the standards of the justice system. Because the person connected to the investigative lead was no longer alive, the development did not result in a criminal prosecution or a courtroom verdict. The case therefore remained open technically, even as modern science provided a clearer understanding of some parts of the investigation. The story of the yogurt shop murders also highlighted the importance of the victims. Over the years, discussions about the case often focused on suspects, evidence, legal decisions, and forensic developments. However, the foundation of the investigation remained the 4 teenagers whose lives ended that night. Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison were the reason the investigation continued. The search for answers was not only about solving a criminal case. It was about understanding what happened to 4 young people and providing clarity for their families. The case also left important lessons about the criminal justice system. It showed that investigations can be affected by the limitations of available technology. It showed that evidence must be carefully examined and that statements obtained during investigations must be evaluated alongside independent evidence. It showed that convictions must be based on reliable information and that courts must remain willing to reconsider previous decisions when new facts emerge. The yogurt shop murders also demonstrated how science can change the future of a case. Evidence that once seemed unable to provide answers may later become a critical part of an investigation. The preservation of biological evidence allowed investigators decades later to examine questions that could not be answered in 1991. This connection between past evidence and modern technology became one of the defining elements of the case. The investigation represented the changing nature of criminal justice over time. In the early 1990s, investigators worked with the tools available to them. Years later, courts reviewed earlier decisions. Eventually, scientists applied advanced methods to evidence that had remained unresolved for decades. Each stage contributed to a more complete understanding of the case. Although the yogurt shop murders did not reach a final legal resolution by 2026, the investigation demonstrated the importance of continuing to search for answers. The absence of a conviction did not mean the evidence had lost value or that the investigation had ended. Cold cases can change as technology advances and as new information becomes available. The case remained a reminder that criminal investigations are not always completed within months or even years. Some require decades of examination, review, and scientific progress. The events that occurred at the Austin yogurt shop in December 1991 continued to influence discussions about forensic science, legal review, and the importance of preserving evidence. The investigation showed both the challenges and possibilities of seeking justice over time. It revealed how damaged evidence can complicate a case, how legal conclusions can be reconsidered, and how scientific advancement can create new opportunities. The yogurt shop murders remained unresolved, but the pursuit of answers continued. More than 30 years later, the case stood as a reminder that every investigation is shaped by the evidence available, the technology of the time, and the willingness to continue searching when questions remain. For the victims and their families, the hope for a complete understanding of what happened remained the most important part of the investigation. The story of the yogurt shop murders was ultimately not only about a crime that shocked Austin. It was about the long process of seeking truth through evidence, science, and careful examination. A case that began with uncertainty continued through decades of investigation and change. And even without a final courtroom conclusion, it remained a powerful example of why unresolved cases continue to matter and why the search for answers does not end with the passage of time.